What's up, everybody? Welcome to Breakshift's neutral card tier list. This one's going to be a little bit different from the other card tier lists because how good or bad these cards are can vary pretty wildly based on which character you're playing as. So instead of trying to have 4 tier lists at the same time or putting letters on screen, I'm just going to pull the cards up one at a time and just keep it all verbal. Some of them have the same rating across all characters, others vary a lot. As per always, of course, we're also going to be ranking the cards with respect to their rarity. And let's go ahead and get started. First up, we have Battle Plan. Battle Plan I would put as an all-around A-tier neutral card for every character. It's just a very generally useful effect, very simple. Draw 2, discard 1, upgrades, draw 3, discard 2. It's a good way to cycle through your deck, and pretty much every character appreciates that somewhat significantly. The only time that you really don't want Battle Plan is if your deck is already completely full of great cards and you don't need anything that's just there for filler or consistency. It's nice for Tempest to generate Zeal. It's nice for Enlightened to hand fix so that he can get the chains going that he needs. It's good on Hidden if you want to discard your token cards like your Hidden Blades and stuff and turn them into real cards. It's good on Daughter for triggering discard synergies, and even without any of that stuff in mind, cycling through your deck is good. So, very nice card. Almost always happy to have at least one copy of this. Next is Blessed Recovery. This one I would... This one's a little bit funky. Me personally, when I play on I-50, I would rank this as a B-tier card for all characters. If you're playing on a lower difficulty, especially if you're not starting out damaged and if you're still healing to full after boss fights, this card's going to go down quite a bit in terms of usefulness. What I often like to do with this card is just swap it in from a basic block, so -1 repeating deflection, -1 parry or whatever, put this in instead. In many cases, if you're playing a card that blocks for 5-ish, just healing for 5 is pretty much just as good, right? You can heal for 5 and then take 5 damage, and it's the same as if you blocked 5. But of course, if you can weave this in and then not take damage, you actually get to net some health. Over the course of several fights, you can make up quite a bit of lost HP if your deck is strong enough. If you have a weak deck, then you probably shouldn't be messing around with this thing. It's just going to cause you more trouble than anything else. But yeah, it's a really nice way to just get rid of some of the chip damage you might have taken, or one bad turn where you get hit for 20 or something. You can get rid of that completely over the course of 4 fights with this thing. So I like it a good bit. It's not something that you keep in your deck forever for the most part, unless you just really want Expel cards to thin your deck out. It does Expel. You just put it in when you need the healing, and then you take it out later. It has this funny upgrade where it purges to heal 1, which theoretically leads to infinite healing as long as you can drag a fight out. But dragging out fights is almost always a bad idea in this game. Enemies scale up pretty quickly, so I would say pretty much never upgrade this card. Just more or less use it like I mentioned, and you'll be pretty happy with it, or just use it as filler. Otherwise, give it a pass. Next, we have Blood for Blood. And this card is horrible. It's awful. It's so bad. I'd put it in C tier for everyone. And this is another one of those situations where if I was so inclined, I'd bump it all the way down to D tier. But we don't need to invent a whole new tier. It's just really bad. It is a 1-cost heavy card, and that's about the only positive thing I can say about it. That's sometimes nice on Tempest with her various heavy synergies. But otherwise, it's just awful. 1 mana deal 12 is not very good. 1 mana deal 24 is reasonable, and you can put Void Stones on it and double trigger them and all that. But you never want to be planning for things to go wrong in a fight, Vault is a game where if your deck is decent and you're playing well, you can perfect almost every fight, right? And the times when you do mess up, often you'll take one big hit here or there, not you're constantly taking damage every turn. So even if you are taking damage in a fight, who knows, maybe you already drew the blood for blood and now you have to cycle all the way back around to find it to get the extra value or something. You can like intentionally try to slightly underblock to just take a little chip damage and activate this, but that will add up. You're not always going to be able to just take one or whatever. You know, if you're taking 2 or 3 or more per fight, that's definitely going to add up in a bad way. And it's just so not worth it. It's not really something that synergizes with most of the characters' game plans. Like I said, outside of Tempest heavy synergy, that's like the only thing you have going for this, so the conditions to make it work are pretty bad. The payoff is not that great. It doesn't scale up into the late game. It's just a bad card. Very bad card. Next we have Concentrate. Concentrate is an interesting one. My opinion of this has changed pretty significantly over the course of my time playing Vault. When I was brand new to the game, I was like, this card is completely useless because you're spending a card to gain net 1 energy, which is exactly the same as purging a card, so it doesn't do anything. And then, as I got a little bit better at the game, I realized, oh hey, there's actually a lot of interesting things you can do with this. Obviously, if you upgrade it, now you're getting overcharged, so it's better than just purging a card. You can put stones in it to get value out of them that way, most notably if you put a black stone in it, even unupgraded, you're getting 2 energy out of 1 card, net, which is really good. If you guys remember in my Enlightened tier list, I was very positive about Reflect, I think is the name of the card, right? Or Deflect, what's it called? What is it called? Oh, we're only on global cards, that's right. There we go, Reflect, this guy. I was really positive on this because of the upgrade Purge, gain 1 energy, so you're getting 2 energy out of 1 card, and I was saying that's super strong, right? Well, Concentrate kind of has the same thing going on if you put a Void Stone in it. Of course, you have to dedicate a black stone to it, which is a highly valuable resource, as opposed to just an upgrade point, which is not that difficult to get, especially for Enlightened. So, not exactly comparable, but it is worth noting. Sometimes being able to generate lots of energy with 1 card is relevant, especially if you've upgraded it with the black stone. You're getting 2 overcharge now. Now it starts to seem really good. But yeah, then taking into account opportunity cost of what it takes to make the Concentrate go well, I've settled somewhere in the middle now with this card, and I would say that it is probably a B tier card for Tempest and Enlightened, and a C tier card for Hidden and Daughter. Tempest obviously has overcharge synergy, so that's a great thing going with this if you upgrade it, and of course it's a good bit better than purging a card for her because you're also generating Zeal when you play this, which is really nice. Not every deck is going to want that still, so it's not an A tier card, but it can be pretty good. And then for Enlightened, it's just a really nice way to get ability chains going, which is often what you're aiming for late game with Enlightened, is you want to chain abilities. And it's also a nice way to fix some of Enlightened's energy issues. He tends to just spend all of his energy like crazy, right? You play cards going Zen, then you play all the cards in Zen because they're free, and now you have nothing left to purge. So having a simple solution to just gaining a lot of energy is quite handy, and especially if you're doing like Blackstone Concentrate and then you go Zen, now each time you play it, you're actually getting the full 2 energy out of it, which is a big deal. Hidden and Daughter can still make use of it, but much less so. Daughter can use it the least. It's worse than purging a card for Daughter because you're not gaining corruption. And Hidden has no real interactions with this card that he particularly cares about, so usually it's not worth the spot in a Hidden deck. Yeah, overall it's pretty useful on Tempest and Enlightened, and not so much otherwise. Next up is Duck and Weave. This is a very simple card. I would probably say it's a B tier for everyone. Obviously, Daughter could theoretically make a bit better use of it with the Sift mechanic. She has lots of stuff that triggers on discard. But that being said, it's still not really phenomenal for her, right? Just because she can make better use of it. She has lots of other cards that Sift or discard in various ways, so you still might not find room for this in your deck. But it is almost always a good upgrade over one of your starting blocks. It's great if you have Voids in the deck, of course. The upgrade is completely fine. It's whatever. Nothing impressive. Maybe if you really need some more block, you upgrade it. Not much to say about this one. Next we have Enough. And Enough, I would probably also say, is B tier for everyone. It's just a big, chunky block card. The overcharge is decent. It is somewhat better on Enlightened because you can foresee it, I guess, which is going to be true of all the expensive cards, of course. But there's not really too much that's going to draw you towards this. Oftentimes, I find myself cutting this by the mid to late game because it just doesn't really do enough to slot into a synergistic deck. It's just a big dumb block at the end of the day. Yeah, so B tier. Next we have Killing Blow. This one I'm also going to say is B tier for everyone. It's quite good in the early game. It's a great way to just clean through the first, like, 4 or 5 fights. Big damage, obviously. The daze is not a problem if you're just killing whatever was attacking you. Even in multi-enemy fights, right? They're not all going to be attacking at once usually, so you can kill the guy that is attacking, and then you don't really care that much about the daze. It's a heavy card, which can be relevant for Tempest. The upgrade on it is pretty significant, up to 32 damage. That's not often are you going to get an upgrade that is this numerically large on a one-cost card, or on any card, actually, to be quite honest. Obviously, the traditional combo that you do with this thing is you put a blue stone on it so you can immediately draw and discard the daze. But I do kind of think that's a waste of a blue stone a lot of the times. Unless your daughter, of course. Especially Corruption Daughter. That's a great combo for her because early game she really struggles to deal damage, and she can resocket the stone later when she no longer needs this. So that's pretty cool. But it's pretty much exclusively a early game card. I've had exactly one run ever in like 700 hours where this card was a significant part of my damage into the late game. So yeah, you know, use it early on and then get rid of it, and it'll serve you pretty well regardless of which character you're playing. Next we have Kneecaps, and this card is pretty bad. This one would probably be another C tier for everyone. It's 1 mana for 3 weak, upgrades to 5 weak. Weak is just not that valuable for the most part, if that's all the card is doing, right? The problem with it is it's basically just block a lot of the time. Like a little bit of block and a little bit of delay block, maybe. If an enemy is attacking you 2 turns out of 3, right, you got 2 real blocking turns. If they're attacking you 1 turn out of 3, you only got 1 turn of block out of it. If they're attacking you 3 turns in a row, I guess you could get 3 turns worth of block, but there are very few enemies that are actually going to do that. Like, I don't know, maybe the Forged Soldier, I guess, is doing that, right? But then it's not even necessarily easy to sneak in the debuff through his plated armor. Yeah, there's not much in the way of synergies with this. You know, I guess, like, Hidden has some debuff stuff, right? Enlightened has some cards that care, but it is basically just a pretty mediocre defensive card for the most part. I almost never use this thing, and when I do slot it in, I'm often disappointed in it. So C tier all around. Maneuver, this one's another very simple, decent card. A lot like Battle Plan, but not quite as good. So probably a B tier for everyone, I would say. Maybe a little bit better on Enlightened, because it does help you with those ability chains. It's a sort of free Zeal thing for Tempest, not really, but kind of. And for everyone else, it's just an okay blocker that also is like a little bit of consistency boosting. It can be nice if you have things that let you double trigger blocking cards. So, you know, if you have the Aegis or something like that, you know, you can draw 2, that's pretty nice. Upgrade is pretty decent, getting up to 7 block, draw 1 on a 1-cost card. That's pretty good value. Nothing, like, staggering, but it's pretty decent. Yeah, that's about all there is to say about this one. It's okay. Next we have Natural 20, and this card is great. This is probably an A tier all-arounder because everyone appreciates Vulnerable. Vulnerable is really, really good. If you don't have it, you should probably be looking for a way to get it, and this is a pretty great way to get it. 2 turns of Vulnerable to everyone is pretty nice, and obviously upgrading to 4 is quite nice as well, especially if you play with Adaptation on, like myself, making sure you actually get multiple turns of Vulnerable out of this. You can put a Blackstone on this thing, and then it's like perma-vuln on everyone, which is pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, really the only time I would not want to run a Natural 20 is if I already have other really good sources of Vulnerable. And that's far from frequent that I have so much Vulnerable that I wouldn't want this. So, yeah, it's good. It's very good. Getting back to some with varied rankings, though, Power Strike. This one's kind of in a bucket of several cards. The Overcharge crew, I guess you could call them. Cards that care about you having Overcharge. And for obvious reasons, these cards are a lot better on Tempest than they are on the other characters. Power Strike in particular is very good on Tempest. I would say A tier for Tempest, because not only is it a Overcharge synergy that deals good damage, but it also is a 1-cost heavy card, and that's really good. 8 damage twice is pretty solid, and upgrading it 8 and then 16, that is a huge increase. Very, very good for Tempest. She loves this thing. This can be one of your core attack cards for an entire run with Tempest. What about everyone else? Well, everyone else doesn't really like it at all, actually. I would probably say it's a C tier for every other class. It just doesn't really do much of anything to synergize with their game plans. None of the other classes really care that much about Overcharge or are super likely to have a ton of Overcharge. You know, maybe you find like some relics or something that are gaining you semi-consistent Overcharge, but even then, especially by the late game, you're probably going to have stuff that is more synergistic with your core strategy rather than this random, awkward, situational damage dealer. So, yeah, C tier for everyone besides Tempest, A tier for Tempest. And you're going to see similar stuff with a lot of the other Overcharge cards. Next, Rinse and Repeat. This one is pretty funky as well. I would say for Enlightened, this is a B tier card. But for Hidden, Tempest, and Daughter, it's a C tier. So what it does is basically kind of stands in as this like awkward, weird black stone for the most part, where you play a card, and then you immediately play Rinse and Repeat to get it back. And then you can replay that card, right? Or purge it if it has a purge effect or whatever. So it's kind of like this pseudo Blackstone. There's some other weird things you can do with it. You can sift a card and then immediately grab it with Rinse and Repeat. If you remember what the last card you played on the previous turn is, or if you just check the log, you can get a card back turn over turn instead of holding the card in your hand. You can play it 2 turns in a row or something. It's got some neat tricks you can do with it, but it is a pretty awkward card. A lot of the time, it doesn't end up being all that useful. It's kind of expensive to use it in all of these ways in terms of energy. If you upgrade it, you get the Overcharge, which sort of refunds the energy, but not really, because you gotta wait. Yeah, just kind of very tricky to really maximize. The reason I put it at B tier for Enlightened, though, is because it has pretty obvious synergies in terms of those ability chains that I keep talking about. Play any ability card and have a Rinse and Repeat in your hand. Well, you can just go Zen now, right? Immediately recur that ability. That's your second ability chain. Play it again. That's 3. Boom. Very easy entrance into Zen there. And, of course, the Zen cost reduction helps with the whole energy cost of this thing. If you're already in Zen, you can play it for free, and then it's a lot more like a Blackstone. Yeah, that's about all I can say about this thing. Not much else to do with it besides the whole Enlightened thing. Next, we've got Riposte, and Riposte is bad. It is a C tier card for pretty much everyone, if you ask me. Again, it's a card that just doesn't really do enough where like in the early game you might put it in because it's a little bit better than a basic block, right? Instead of playing parry for 5 block, you can play riposte for 5 block, and you're also dealing 7 damage, which is like fine, I guess, but even in that case, it's like, well, what if I am going to be getting more value out of purging my parry? There's actually a decent chance that that is going to be the case in the early game, where that 2 block can matter quite a bit. The 7 damage could matter quite a bit too, but, you get the idea, right? It's not really a strict upgrade all the time, and it doesn't really synergize with just about any game plan. It starts to fall off pretty rapidly. Just about the only time I use this card past the very early game is, funnily enough, because it has no synergy with your game plan. So I sometimes use this in hidden decks when I want to have non-swift attack cards. If you have something like the Cutting Fan, for example, you don't want to use your combo up triggering the Cutting Fan and then get a bunch of hidden blades now that you have no combo to spend on them. So a card like Riposte can help you increment your Cutting Fan or your Blade Belt or whatever without spending your combo. So I guess that's something you could say in Riposte's favor. That's not exactly high praise. Any other decent attack card that isn't Swift, would probably be doing a better job than Riposte. The fact that it's both an attack and a block has some upside and some downside. It's really bad to play against the guys that don't like you to block, like the Death Knight or whatever. It can be good or bad if you have the cards that'll like double on a block card or something, right? If you have the Aegis, maybe you really don't want to be wasting it on Riposte. But on the other hand, maybe you really did need that extra block. It's kind of a wash. Generally not a big fan of this one, though. Next, Second Chance. Second Chance is a pretty interesting one. Quite strong in the early game, actually. 20 damage for 2 costs is not at all a bad deal early on. And most importantly, of course, is that Slay Draw 2. Really fantastic way to dunk the multi-enemy early fights. It's not difficult at all to just do a little bit of chip damage to one guy and then immediately kill him with your Second Chance and immediately draw 2 cards, and then you can block whatever damage is on the stack or go for more kills. Very handy. Especially if you do end up upgrading this thing. 25 damage and gaining an energy on kill is just ridiculous in the early game. This is just going to absolutely slaughter every multi-enemy fight. Almost for the entirety of the first floor, if you upgrade it. That being said, I'm not very fond of upgrading it myself personally. It can certainly carry you through that early game, right? But obviously you will cut it by the late game, even by the mid game most of the time, because when it's not getting that slay, it's pretty bad. And you're going to want to put in better, more synergistic cards. So if you're someone who just wants to, secure that early game and make sure that you can get towards the later part of the run, then I guess you can upgrade this thing and then it'll be really, really good. And if you don't want to do that and you want to be greedy, then it's still pretty strong. Just, you're going to need at least a little bit more to ensure that you clear through the early game with it, but still worth including for sure. So definitely a B tier card for me for pretty much everyone. I guess Tempest has the least need for such a card, but it's still decent on her. Next we've got Shield Bash. And Shield Bash is probably a B tier card as well. It applies 2 vulnerable. That's pretty good. 10 block for 2. Not fantastic, but it's alright. Really, it is the vulnerable that you care about. Vulnerable being something that you always want, like I mentioned with the natural 20. Shield Bash is usually a less good way to get that vulnerable, because it is kind of expensive, right? For 2 energy, you're only getting 2 vulnerable on 1 target, compared to natural 20's 1 energy for 2 to everyone. What's more, the upgrade does not improve the vulnerable. It just gives you 5 extra block. Very often, I'm really happy to find this early as just a way to get vulnerable down. And by the late game, I find myself playing it less and less until eventually I just have to cut it. Because I'll have found some other way of getting vulnerable that's better. Sometimes you're not going to find a better way, and then this will stick around and be a good card. But most of the time, I think that doesn't happen. So I'll kind of put it in a similar position as the Second Chance. It's quite strong in the early game, probably falls off later on. B tier all around sounds about right for that. Next we've got Surefoot, and I love Surefoot. Known fan of this card. It does a lot of stuff for you, but this all hinges on upgrading it. Pretty much every card that upgrades to, say, Rebound is very bad without Rebound and very good with Rebound on it, so high priority upgrade. I would probably say don't even really bother playing this until you've upgraded it. Even just replacing a basic block with this thing is a little bit questionable sometimes. But once the upgrade is down, then you're cooking. It's really flexible at that point, as all Rebound cards are, right? Because you always have the option of double playing the card, single playing the card and purging it, or playing it and holding it for next turn. It becomes a great Voidstone carrier. It becomes a great way to do chains with Enlightened. It can be a Zeal generator on Tempest. I mean, it's just really, really flexible. In addition, the fact that it's providing an offensive and a defensive utility, and they're both pretty good, means that it's almost never bad to draw this, regardless of whatever's happening on that turn. If you're being attacked, you'll appreciate the block. If you're trying to deal a bunch of damage, you'll appreciate the rage. If you want both of those effects, as is often the case, then you'll be really happy. Very frequently, I put either red or yellow stone in this to double down on one of the two aspects. If you put a red stone in this thing, upgrade it, and play it twice, that is 100% rage with one card, which is huge, and you got 10 block along the way, so very, very handy. If you put a yellow stone in it, then you can play it twice for 50% rage and 18 block, which, I mean, those are really impressive numbers. Obviously, I am talking about upgrading and putting a stone in it. You know, a lot of cards look good in those contexts, but this is one of the best uses of some of those resources for most decks, I would say. In fact, I'll often include multiple copies of Surefoot, upgrade both of them, and put a stone in both of them. Very big Surefoot fan. I would definitely say it's an A tier all around. Next, we have the all-new Surprise Attack. I guess it's not that new at this point, but man, this card was just in the dumpster for so long. Would have been an easy C tier or worse, one of the worst cards in the game, but now it's actually pretty good. Good enough, I would say, to probably be an all-arounder B tier card. It has a lot of text on it at this point. So let's conceptualize it real quick. If the target's attacking, you apply 1 weak. If the target is not attacking, you apply a vulnerable 1 and deal 9 damage. Then no matter what, after that, you deal 14 damage. So if they're attacking, you're getting immediate value out of the block, of course, and then you're also dealing 14 damage. If they're not attacking, you're getting a lot of damage on them. Vulnerable before both the 9 and 14 damage trigger, so they'll both be modified, getting that 1.5 times multiplier. You're hitting pretty hard with this thing. Plus, since they're not attacking, you can pile on more damage and not need to worry too much about setting up for the next turn. So you can milk a lot of value out of that one stack of vulnerable. And if you upgrade this thing, it gets even better. Now it doesn't have the otherwise condition. So you just get the weak if they're attacking, and no matter what, you get that vulnerable 9 damage and 14 damage, which is very impressive in the early game. This is going to absolutely clobber a lot of early fights. Even against elites, it's pretty good. That being said, it ends up in the same situation as Second Chance, where I usually try to greed and not upgrade this because I like to save my upgrades for more impactful cards from the long-term perspective of the run. But if you do upgrade this early on, it'll definitely carry you. You'll be pretty happy with it. So it kind of ends up in that same B-tier sort of bucket. You'll cut it almost always by the mid to late game, but it does great work early on. Next up, we have Tower Shield, and Tower Shield is probably an A tier for everyone. This card's quite strong. This is basically what Enough wishes it was. You get a lot of block. 30 is a huge amount. Obviously, it expels, which is kind of sad. You'd like to keep this thing around, I would think, in most decks. But that's not a big deal, because if you just upgrade it, it gets this awesome Purge effect. Delay block 5 for Purge is really, really nice. That's a very strong option, and it means that you can get value out of this thing consistently over a fight instead of just using it once and being done with it. It's just a steady drip of delay block, and then when you do really need that 30 immediate block, it's there for you as a nice panic button. Very, very good card. It's especially good with Enlighten's Foresight, of course, because then you can still just keep purging it, and the Foresight does not go away when you purge the card. It's not until you actually play it. So then it's a 0 cost 30 block at that point. Really cool interaction that you can do there. But, I mean, yeah, everyone just appreciates a big influx of blocks sometimes. There are a lot of enemies that just hit you super hard all of a sudden, and having a one-card answer to that is appreciated. So, A tier all around. It's great. Next we have Unload. 20 damage, Sift 2. Upgrades to deal 22 damage in Sift 3. Pretty minor upgrade for a pretty minor card. This card is not really a big deal, like, at all for any deck. You're not, like, super enthused to see it early on. You don't care about it later on. It is okay in the early game. It's an okay damage dealer. Where it shines the best, I suppose, is when you're starting with Voids and you find it early, because then the damage is relevant and the sifting is pretty relevant. But otherwise, yeah, not so special. Even on, like, Daughter, where you have all those discard effects, you're almost certainly going to have significantly better ways to trigger them than with an Unload. It's just kind of expensive. 2 for 20 is not phenomenal. It's decent in the early game. But, you know, comparing to something like Second Chance with that incredible Slay effect, Sift 2 doesn't seem quite so good. So I'd still give it a B tier all around, I think, because everyone does appreciate at least a bit more dense damage in the early game, and this is denser damage than you probably have in your starter deck. You know, I like Tempest with Smite, I guess, has it beat, but for most other characters, yeah, this is a reasonable way to deal some early damage. So B tier, probably cut it a little sooner than stuff like Surprise Attack or Second Chance, unless you really do need that Sift to handle Voids or something. So next, we've got Wound. Wound is very similar to Shield Bash. It is a somewhat mediocre 2-cost card that applies Vulnerable. Vulnerable 2, just like Shield Bash, and unlike Shield Bash, the upgrade actually does improve the Vulnerable. But notably, just going up to 3 means that it does not play nicely with Adaptation. The damage upgrade is fine. Note that the damage happens before the Vulnerable, which is a little unfortunate. Yeah, pretty much everything I said about Shield Bash applies to this. It's good if you just need Vulnerable, because Vulnerable is very important, so probably worth playing if you don't have anything else, but you would like to swap this out for better Vulnerable pretty quickly in most cases. Mostly just due to the cost. 2 cost is a lot. The block from Shield Bash tends to give you better utility than the damage from Wound does most of the time, I would say. But just because of that upgrade, going up to 3 Vulnerable, you know, that does matter sometimes. So they're about on the same level. B tier for both of them, for all characters, more or less. Next, we've got another one of the Overcharge crew, Yin Yang. Deal 14 damage if you have Overcharge trigger +1. Upgrades to be 18 damage, which is, of course, being doubled by that extra trigger. It's not quite as good as Power Strike in most cases, I would say, because, you know, it is expensive. Even though it does get the extra trigger, which is good for putting a stone in it. Just the cheap 1-cost Power Strike, I find, is easier to make use of. Yin Yang by no stretch bad, though, for Tempest. Definitely still an A-tier card for Tempest, I would say. Plays nicely with Rage. You can put a purple stone in there, and then you're actually getting 2 overcharge out of this thing, which is a good deal. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much all there is to it, right? It's just Power Strike, but bigger 99% of the time. So Hidden, Enlightened, Daughter don't really make much use of this thing. C tier for all of them. Tempest likes it quite a bit, although it's not unheard of for me to be actually looking at cutting this thing by the late game. More often than not, the only reason I end up keeping this in the deck in the late game is because I already invested in it with upgrades and stones, and it does okay. But especially by the time you're fighting like the Void, it's not uncommon to see yourself not playing the Yin Yang just because it's too expensive and you'd rather spend your energy on other stuff. Still an A tier for Tempest, though. Next we got Arcane Overload, and I don't like this card very much. In theory, you would expect this would be a lot better with some of the classes than with others. Like, so, Corruption Daughter, obviously, it's like, oh, you just only have abilities almost in your starting deck. So Arcane Overload would be really good there, right? Well, no, not really, actually. It turns out it's not particularly easy to play a huge number of abilities to pump this thing up and get good damage out of it. It's possible, but even in decks with like huge amount of like drawing effects and discarding effects and all that jazz, it's still kind of tricky to set this up. If you draw it on the wrong turn, it's very, very low impact. It is an uncommon card too, of course, so we've raised the bar a little bit by this point. The upgrade is not super impactful. +2 damage base, +2 damage for each other ability played this turn. It's not at all uncommon to be playing this when you've only played like 2 other abilities on the turn. So unupgraded, that would be 16 damage for 1, which like sounds pretty decent. But it's kind of got this weird problem with it where in the early game, when you would appreciate something like that, you're not going to have a lot of consistency with your draws to get this alongside other abilities. And then by the late game, when you are going to have the ability to draw it alongside abilities or play more and more abilities, at that point the damage starts to look pretty bad in comparison to some of your other more synergistic options, right? So, you know, Enlightened is rather going to be doing Future Strike or something that scales off of Fatigue. Daughter is going to be doing something that scales off of her Corruption. You know, Enlightened or Hidden is using something that interacts with Combo. Nobody really wants this just big dumb damage stick that doesn't interact with anything. Yeah, so with all that said, I would probably have to put it in C tier for everyone. I've pretty much never been able to make this card do all that much. It is okay at best and quite bad at worst, which is not a good place for a card to be. Next, we have Battle Cry. So remember on Kneecaps when I said that weak is not very good if that's all it's doing? Well, Battle Cry has this pretty cool upgrade, where instead of just applying 2 weak to all enemies, it applies 2 weak and 2 slow to all enemies. And that's actually pretty good. That is a very powerful debuff. Probably the most powerful debuffing card in the game is an upgraded Battle Cry. This is going to be a very significant reduction in incoming damage for 2 turns. The problem with it, though, is without the upgrade, it's still pretty bad. 2, obviously, a bad number for adaptation. 2 is also a bad number to be paying for a card that does not deal any immediate damage or give you any immediate block. It's very slow, and usually you want to be going pretty fast in Vault. You want to be trying to kill stuff by around turn 4 is what I always say. So Battle Cry, not all that great for accomplishing that goal. It's hard to justify spending the upgrade point on this a lot of times. In many cases, I would rather just spend the upgrade on part of my damage dealing cards and just kill the enemies that much faster instead of trying to reduce their damage output. In the right deck, this can be the correct call. It's not horrible by any stretch. If you have the ability to upgrade it mid-fight, for example, with some of Enlightened's cards, or something like a Quicksmith or whatever, then it can be pretty solid. You just kind of get the free upgrade on it, and you'll get good value out of it. But overall, I can't really give it anything better than a B. No one really takes particular advantage of this. You know, I guess, again, debuff Hidden, you know, kind of exists. Enlightened kind of cares about having that slow synergy sometimes. But it's not super likely that you're going to have the cards that interact with that and then draw them together in a way that you can actually get value, and it's better than anything else you could have done. So, yeah, we'll give it a B tier for everyone, I think. I think that's fair. Next, we've got Bulwark, and Bulwark is really good. Bulwark, I would probably say, is A tier for everyone. It's really strong. Tempest maybe could make it even better. I don't think it's quite good enough for S tier for anybody, but it is very strong in general on everybody, I would say. Being able to draw 1 card every single turn is really good. It's going to pay back the 3 energy you spend on it. If you upgrade it, of course, only having to spend 2 energy on it, it just makes that an even better deal. It's so much easier to actually start generating energy off of this thing, or value in general, right? Cards versus energy. But even if you're not actually thinking about it in the context of generating value, it's just a solid consistency booster too, right? You know, seeing more cards, very handy. You can double stack this guy once you've upgraded it, you know, put a Blackstone on it, and then it's really nice. A lot of decks that just really don't mind at all squeezing this thing in there. It's a great option for decks that are going slower, so early Enlightened appreciates this thing a lot. Corruption Daughter in the early game appreciates this thing a lot. And it has really nice applications even in aggressive decks with some of those cards that just happen to have the block tag on them as well. So something like a Paragon on Tempest, right? Pretty handy. In general, I love this thing. What else is there to say? Definitely an A tier. Now we've got another one of the Overcharge crew, Charged Block. As per usual, this is going to be a C for Hidden, Enlightened, and Daughter, because they just don't really care about Overcharge, and they're not super likely to have it. You know, the effective outcome of this is that you're paying 1 energy for 10 block, which is pretty decent, and you're gaining 1 Overcharge when you trigger this energy, right? That's pretty decent. But it's not, like, amazing. It's not something that you're going to alter your deck to try and make happen. So unless you just, by chance, have a lot of Overcharge already, then it's just really not worth it. For those 3 characters, that is, of course. Obviously, Tempest, as per always, is going to have a better time with this, but unlike the other Overcharge cards, this one's only going to be a B for her, not an A, because, again, the payoff is just not quite significant enough, if you ask me. It's a defensive card exclusively, right? And so it's just, by that nature, not as strong as something that just deals a crap ton of damage in the context of a Tempest run. Because that's what Tempest wants to do. She wants to hit things really hard and just kill them quickly. And Charge Block doesn't assist with that. It's just an okay block. So, yeah, B tier for her, C tier for the rest. And we move on to Crippling Blow. Crippling Blow is an interesting one because it's kind of like, in the way that a lot of those Overcharge cards almost feel like they're just Tempest cards that can randomly show up on other runs. Crippling Blow to me kind of just feels like an Enlightened card that can randomly show up in other character runs. It is a big, heavy 3-cost card. So obviously, naturally, you immediately start to think about Foresight on this thing. It applies slow, which Enlightened has, you know, extra synergies with. It deals immediate damage, which can be an issue that Enlightened runs into early games, not having enough immediate damage. You're waiting for Future Strike. You just would rather hit something now. Crippling Blow does that. The upgrade makes it even more damaging. You get a little bit of weak too. That being said, though, it's actually not all that impressive for Enlightened still. This one is basically, like, Charge Block, in that I only am going to give it a B tier for Enlightened and a C tier for the rest, right? Where the potential, like, synergies and interactions are virtually non-existent for Hidden, Tempest, and Daughter with this one. You just don't really care about slow. The fact that it's 3-cost and heavy, like, I guess technically that's good for Tempest, right? Heavy cards, it gives you Zeal, but Tempest is going to have better things to do than this, right? Again, she just wants to hit things hard and kill them immediately. She doesn't really care about applying slow. 21 damage for 3 does not look all that great compared to some other Tempest stuff. If you just have, like, a ton of Foresight and you have some slow synergy, then, like, I guess you're reasonably happy for this in Enlightened. Usually, I just kind of put it in as a big, chunky damage dealer, and even then, I'm a little disappointed with the numbers on it. The 2 slow can be nice in some early elite fights, right? Like versus Bruce, and potentially versus the Skeletal Mage, although even then, getting it to line up on a turn where Skeletal Mage is actually attacking with all of his Frenzy isn't the easiest thing in the world to do. So, yeah. B tier for Enlightened, C tier for the rest. Next we have Discovery. Discovery is another card that I kind of went through a variety of opinions on, similar to Concentrate. Put a card from deck to hand, right? It's like a green stone, but in card form, but it itself is not like green stoned. So the best use case for this thing sort of is to put a green stone in it, and then you can put a different stone in the card that you actually want. Most notably, that would be like you put a black stone in a power, and then you still can quote-unquote rig it by using Discovery with a green stone in it, which is a lot of hoops to jump through, but that can be a huge deal. I mean, there's a lot of powers that can kind of break the game, especially when double stacked, and guaranteeing that you get them down turn 1 is a really big deal. It is decent filler because it just expels itself and replaces itself in the hand, so even if that does come as a net minus in terms of like overall value because you have to pay for it, it's still pretty okay in those aspects, so good for a deck that wants to be small. The upgrade makes it not expel, which I guess should theoretically boost your consistency. If again, with the green stone, when it doesn't expel, that's pretty nice because when you reshuffle, it is always going to be on top, and you can guarantee whichever cards you need at that moment, right? You know, block or a damage or whatever it is you're looking for. You have the whole deck to pick from at that point. So that's good, I guess. But a lot of the time, you don't really have a stone to dedicate this thing, or you don't really care about using it either as filler or as consistency, and it's just like this weird kind of mediocre card. Nevertheless, I wouldn't put it in C tier, definitely not. So I guess it just gets to be in B by default at that point. It has its uses, and it's not exactly overwhelmingly powerful in any of those cases, but it's pretty alright. So yeah, B tier for everyone. No one really makes particular use of this thing over the others. Do-Over. Do-Over is another card that's gone through some changes. Where it stands now, it is a very all-over-the-place kind of card, right? It's 3 costs, so you're investing a lot of your energy for the turn into this thing, and it just kind of does a whole bunch of stuff. You get 8 block, you get 8 damage, you get a random attack, you get a random ability. Very volatile in terms of how relevant it's actually going to be on any given turn. You need to be having it on a turn where you actually need block in order to get value out of that. You want to be dealing damage, and you need to have at least 1 attack and 1 ability in the discard pile in order to make use of. Obviously, you can purge them from the hand before you play this to potentially get some value that way, right? Like if you draw this in the opening hand, you could just purge a different attack and a different ability and then play this and get the value that way. You're not always going to be able to do that, of course. You're not always even going to be able to play this thing at all at 3 costs. It's pretty expensive. And if you're not getting value from each of its effects, then it starts to look pretty bad. But if you are getting value from all of its effects, it's pretty decent. The upgrade on this one just ups the damage and block, which is very whatever. I don't think most decks are probably going to have room for this. It is a heavy card, so, you know, maybe there's some stuff going on with Tempest there. It's really good with Foresight, of course, as a 3-cost card, so maybe some stuff with Enlightened going on there. The fact that you can recur stuff is cool if you have a lot of purge effects, I guess, right? So, you know, maybe there's some stuff to do with Daughter there. Overall, just a very weird card. Not bad for the most part, but not great. I give it like a B. You know, it's just kind of like B- tier, to be quite honest. Usually I wouldn't bother with this card, but it's not horrible. Next we've got Footwork, and Footwork is also kind of a card that feels sort of like an Enlightened card that can just show up elsewhere, because it's pretty much just repeating Deflection but better, right? Instead of 3 block now, 5 block next turn, 4 block now, 6 block next turn, and the upgrade is 6 block now and 9 block next turn, which is quite a bit of block total for 1 energy, right? 1 for 10 total block is already pretty decent, and you upgrade that, and now you're getting 15 total block. That is a lot. Of course, you actually have to be getting full value out of both sides of the block in order for it to work that way, And if you're not being attacked 2 turns in a row, then that isn't the case. But even then, 9 delay block for 1 energy is pretty reasonable a lot of the time. So if you're only getting delay block value, that's still pretty okay. 6 delay block even, it's also kind of okay for a lot of characters. It's not really bringing the house down, but it's pretty solid. So pretty much a B tier for everyone. I guess you could try and argue that it should be like A tier for Enlightened because it is just like a power crept repeating deflection. But repeating deflection is such trash that I don't even think that justifies making it A tier for him. It's not that footwork is great for him, it's just that repeating deflection is awful, right? So yeah, B tier for all the characters on footwork as well. Now we've got Furious Assault, cousin to Arcane Overload. This one's definitely a bit better because it is a lot easier to play many attacks in one turn, if you're on Hidden in particular, of course. Spam out a lot of Hidden Blades and Silent Shivs. You have, in the Bleed starter deck, a card that's 2 attacks in 1 already straight out the gate. You got lots of relics that generate Hidden Blades and such, so it's not that hard to make this thing go kind of crazy. If you're on Enlightened and you have stabilities, then that's pretty dang good with Furious Assault, especially early on when you're dealing with single targets like elites, because that Shi is very bad against stuff like Corpse Mound early on, notoriously so. Furious Assault can be a really good way to turn that around. It becomes free while you're in Zen. All very good stuff. Good enough that I think it warrants being a B tier for Hidden and Enlightened, because it is still somewhat situational, and if you draw it with the wrong hand, you'll be very upset because unlike a lot of other cards that just deal a big chunk of damage immediately, if you draw them on the wrong turn, it's like, oh, well, you know, you can just play it and deal the damage anyway, and maybe you take a hit instead, but at least you're ending the fight, right? With Furious Assault, if you draw it on the wrong turn, you can't actually get damage out of it. It just only deals like, 6 or 11 damage, and that's really bad. So a bit more volatile in that regard, but the ceiling is also quite a bit higher on it, so a bit of give and take there. Whereas, of course, for Tempest and Daughter, this card does not look so good. Tempest tends to play more big, expensive cards, so X costs, 3 costs, that kind of stuff. Daughter tends to play lots of abilities if you're on Corruption. Even if you're on Soul Tithe, you're usually not playing out a whole bunch of attacks. You're usually doing something like, gain some Rage, gain some Death Strike, play 1 attack that triggers multiple times and has a shit ton of damage because of my Corruption being high or something, right? So a C tier for Daughter and Tempest, I would say. The upgrade on this one, pretty straightforward. 2 more damage up front, 2 more damage for each attack, just like Arcane Overload. Yeah, I've had some Hidden decks where this was an integral part of my damage plan for most of the run. I don't think I've ever had it be that prominent of a damage source on Enlightened, but it's so good, specifically with the Shi starting deck, at dealing with early elites, that I do think it warrants a B tier for him. Yeah, so that's where I stand on this one. B for Hidden and Enlightened, C for Daughter and Tempest. Next up is Imprint. Imprint is a very interesting card. Add 2 volatile copies of the next attack played to your hand, then expel. Upgrades to add 3 volatile copies. Pretty interesting use cases on almost every character. This can be a Hidden Blade or Silent Shiv generator on Hidden, which is kind of interesting. It can be a way to get attack chains going on Enlightened, which is interesting. Or, if you're using this to complete an ability chain, maybe, then you can play a 1-cost card while you're in Zen for free and you get a bunch of free copies. That's pretty good. If you're on Tempest and Daughter, it's not quite as easy to take advantage of, but there's definitely still ways to do it. I had a run where I duplicated Kingdom Comes with Imprint. That was really cool. I had like 6 copies of an upgraded Kingdom Comes in my hand, which was really fun. Tempest probably can make the least use out of it, but even then it's not horrible. Even if you're just getting extra copies of a Batter or something, that can be quite a bit of rage. Yeah, there's almost always some way that you can use this to decent effect. It sort of stands in as extra copies of some of your best attacks. Obviously, you do need to draw it at the right time, so it has some inherent inconsistency to it. If you don't have a good attack in your hand, or if you don't have any attack in your hand, God forbid, then it does literally nothing. And that's very bad, of course. But it does carry over from turn to turn, if you didn't know, right? So even if you don't have any attacks in hand, you can still play this, and you'll get to an attack eventually, right? And it'll go off at that point, which is, it's worth noting. All in all, a tough one to evaluate. I think I'm going to put it in B tier for everyone, because they all do have some neat little tricks they can do with it. Maybe it's a C tier for Tempest. I think it's good enough to be a B tier for her too, though. Next we have Now We Wait, and this might be pretty contentious, but I'm just going to say it right now. Now We Wait is a C tier for everyone, if you ask me. This card is so weird because some of the most broken stuff that you can do in the game is only possible because of Now We Wait, because this adds 2 real copies of any card in your deck. So this can set up infinites, this can set up truly outrageous combos. You can do all sorts of really insane stuff with this. You can duplicate copies of like Hide and never have your damage stack trigger for the rest of the fight. You can just do all kinds of insane things with this. You can duplicate like a Blessed Recovery and get as much healing as you want. Truly ridiculous, the ceiling on this thing. But that's not really super relevant if you ask me, because it's so slow that most of the time you'd be better off not messing around with the flashy, hilarious shenanigans. If you're thinking of it purely in terms of win rate, I don't think Now We Wait is a good card most of the time. Right? When you play this card, you're losing 1 card in hand that you're discarding for its effect, and you're losing the Now We Wait. So that's minus 2 cards in hand, and the cards that you're generating as copies go into the discard pile, so you have to draw through your whole deck, reshuffle, and then draw through some additional unknown number of cards until you finally get to the duplicated copies. That's really slow. The Now We Wait itself, of course, being an expel card, you can, use a Now We Wait on a Now We Wait. If you upgrade it, you're getting 4 copies and stuff, right? But none of that actually answers the problem I have with this thing of it just being so slow. Usually, you could just ignore this thing, not do the shenanigans, and win before you would have ever even found those extra copies. So, a great card for really pushing the limits of the game, and it can be a very fun card, but I'm going to give it a C tier for power level. Call me crazy. Next, One Hit Wonder with a hyphen. One Hit Wonder is a neutral X cost card, which is unusual, and it is very strong, actually. Pretty much across the board, it's a strong card. This is actually going to be the first S tier that I'm going to give out for a neutral card, and that's going to be on Tempest. This thing is an S tier. It is ridiculous. It is just literally twice as strong as Smite. Obviously, it expels, of course, but I mean, that's insane. It's just twice as good as one of her starting cards. It's already quite good, like a big part of the reason I like the Lightning starter deck, or no, the Thunder starting? The reason I like the one that comes with Smite is specifically because of that Smite. It's a great way to clear through early elites and early single target fights in general. Usually it falls off by the late game, but it's so powerful at pushing you through the early game. This is just twice as good. Very often you're playing that Smite for a kill, so why not just deal more damage with it? Who cares about the fact that it expels? The fight's going to be over, right? Super duper duper strong, and it carries well into the late game. The upgrade adds another 6 damage to it per energy spent, which is fantastic. X-cost cards naturally scale up with Tempest because you're going to have much higher energy generation as the run continues. So definitely worth an S tier for Tempest. As for the other characters, it's still really good. For Hidden and Daughter, I'd give it an A tier. because just like how Smite carries that one Tempest starting deck through the early game pretty well, this is going to carry just about any Hidden or Daughter deck through the early game really well. It's a great damage solution for Corruption Daughter. It's pretty good with Sultide Daughter too. You know, generate a bit of rage, and this thing is going to absolutely demolish people, even if it is hard to death strike it because you're probably spending a lot of energy on it. And Hidden appreciates it too. It's just a big way to kill things. The only character I'm going to give it less than an A for is Enlightened, of course. He gets a B tier for this thing because it is still pretty dang good at helping you out in the early game, but its long-term potential is significantly decreased on him because X-cost cards and Enlightened are like oil and water. They just don't mix well. You don't want to have to spend all your energy on this thing, because then it's very difficult to do chain-related stuff, right? Like, if you're trying to play a bunch of attacks, this thing has to be the last attack you play, and then you're completely out of energy after the fact. If you're in Zen, it doesn't get any sort of cost-reducing benefit. And as I mentioned, of course, Enlightened is kind of energy-hungry anyway. He often doesn't have much energy to dump in this thing, even if he wants to. So, just a little bit harder to use long-term with him, although it is still fantastic in the early game, which is why it still gets a B tier. Yeah, so to recap there, S tier on Tempest, A tier on Hidden and Daughter, B tier on Enlightened. Very good card all around. Next up we have Opening Move. Opening Move is probably a B tier for everyone, but maybe I could see this being bumped down for Enlightened, who is always going to have some opener cards in his starter deck, and almost always has some opener cards in his deck throughout most of the run. The other characters have fewer opener effects, and so it's less bad for them. Obviously, it interacts with Overcharge, so Tempest maybe likes it a bit more. But these are pretty minor differences. I don't think it's enough to bump it up or down a tier for those characters. For the most part, it's just a pretty reasonable early game damage dealer, right? 1 energy net for 16 damage and an Overcharge is quite strong in the early game. If you upgrade it, then you're dealing 21 damage, which is quite good, actually, in the early game. So, kind of ends up in the bucket with Second Chance and Unload and all those other cards where pretty good in the early game, pretty mediocre in the mid to late game, and is probably going to get cut. But, you know, sometimes that's just what you need, right? You got to kill Corpse Mound somehow. Next up, we've got Planned Strike, and Planned Strike is kind of crazy. I like Planned Strike a lot. This is going to be our second S tier for Tempest. Tempest loves Planned Strike. You really do want to upgrade it, of course. By default, 12 damage and drawing 1 card is not bad. 15 damage and drawing 2 cards is great. Pretty frequently, I'll put a Blackstone on this thing and Tempest, upgrade it, and then it just goes absolutely crazy. It's a ton of Zeal. It's a ton of damage. It filters through your deck really quickly. Very, very strong. So definitely an easy S tier for Tempest, if you ask me. For the rest of the characters, Hidden, Daughter, and Enlightened, I would actually probably still put it in B tier, the first of the overcharged crew that gets to not be C tier for people besides Tempest. Because, I mean, the upside on this one is really big, right? Like, the other ones, the problem was that their payoff just wasn't quite good enough to justify their inconsistency. This one's payoff, if you upgrade it, is quite strong. You know, you're spending 2 energy on this, but then you're drawing 2 cards, so you're breaking even in terms of net value, but being able to look at more cards is really good. It lets you set up purge effects, it lets you cycle through your deck faster. You know, the Blackstone thing works for other characters too, right? So doubling the ability to cycle and see more cards and stuff. Pretty powerful. Not nearly as good as with Tempest, of course, but definitely still good. So S on Tempest and B for everybody else. Next is Quick Escape. Quick Escape's a fun one. So, obviously, it's not very good to play this card. 1 mana for 6 block is pretty bad. Even upgraded 1 mana for 8 block is not phenomenal. You're probably going to be able to do better that with just about any other upgraded block card, besides starter block. It's all about that discard effect. The discard effect is fantastic. 12 block on discard is massive. You know, I'm a known fan of Diversion, And this is just like way better diversion in terms of the discard effect, right? Especially if we upgrade it. 16 block on discard. That's huge. So if you can reliably discard this thing, it's great. So no surprise, that means that I would put this as an A-tier Daughter card. Daughter can discard cards very easily, especially with the Curse spell. And even if you don't have that, of course, you're quite likely to have some other discarding effects. You know, interacts with void coins and all that. Very, very nice. So, A-tier for Daughter, yeah. But for Hidden, it's also not super difficult to discard this thing. Obviously, it goes well with blue stones on Swift cards, because you're drawing a whole bunch of cards one at a time and discarding them. If you find Quick Escape anywhere in the middle of that, just pitch it, 12 block, very nice. Obviously, you also have cards like Juggle and Hidden's other various draw and discard effects, or just straight-up discard effects like Phantom Walk and stuff, right? So, pretty decent there. Going on down to Tempest and Enlightened, the discarding is a lot harder to come by. Tempest has, like, Seek Higher Power, and that's pretty much it in terms of stuff in her card pool that helps her draw and discard. And Enlightened has, like, he has a couple Sift effects, he has a couple random discard effects, you know, stuff like Asceticism. Yeah, you know, it's not fantastic, but no, I don't really think there is a but. Yeah, it's not fantastic on Tempest and Enlightened. C tier for them, but definitely a B tier for Hidden, definitely an A tier for Daughter. Pretty strong card in the right hands. Next, we have Recharge. Recharge is probably an A tier for Enlightened. It's not like a super solid A tier, but I do think it's worth it. This is a really strong way to control your chain, because obviously you just play this and get whatever you need out of the discard pile. If you're getting an ability, you already have an ability chain. If the rest of your hand is all attacks, though, you can just grab an attack anyway. Or whatever, because, you know, if the rest of your hand is attacks, you're already going Zen with attacks probably, and then you can just play whatever you grab on the cheap. If you upgrade this thing, then it doesn't expel, and you can keep reusing it, which is potentially pretty powerful. Especially using things like Vision, you can put this back on top of the deck, and you can just keep grabbing the same card over and over again, which is pretty cool. For Hidden, Tempest, and Daughter, it's just like a pretty okay filler card. It's a decent little consistency boost, very similar to Discovery. Instead of choosing a card from the deck, you're choosing a card from the discard pile. So it doesn't have the same utility in terms of like setting up powers and stuff, but it's still pretty solid. A lot better to just randomly draw into in the middle of a fight than Discovery most of the time, I would say. So I do like it. Yeah, B tier for the other characters, A for Enlightened. Next we got Redo, a pretty similar card. It's free, but it recurs a random card. And I am pretty much going to give it the same ranking of B tier for Hidden, Tempest, and Daughter. But I do think that this actually is weaker on Enlightened, enough to bump it down to B tier for him as well. So B tier for everybody on this card. Obviously not being able to choose exactly which card you get completely ruins the chain consistency element of this thing. Who knows what you're going to get? It might not be the right card for your chain. If you upgrade it, you're getting 2 random cards, which I guess you have a better chance of getting the thing you want, but still, the consistency was what made Recharge really good for Enlightened, and this doesn't have that. That being said, it is a bit better at just being a generic filler card, because since it's free, it has no cost associated with it. It doesn't cost you in terms of energy, it doesn't cost you in terms of cards. So, very, very good filler. But, you know, that's not exactly a great accolade to have on a card that is great filler. So, it'll just be a B tier for everybody. Reinforcements. Reinforcements is probably also B tier for everyone. This one's interesting. It's got a couple different ways to make use of it. So, 3 volatile smashes for 0 energy. Smash being a 2-cost card that deals decent damage and gives you quite a bit of rage. Very difficult, of course, to actually play 3 Smashes in a turn. That's 6 energy. So you'd have to be dedicating your entire turn to doing this. If you upgrade it, it has this other interesting effect, though, where you can purge to gain a volatile Smash. So unupgraded, it has 2 use cases, I would say, which is you play it and then you play Smashes to deal damage, or you play it and then you use the Smashes as discard fodder to potentially be essentially just drawing cards in a very roundabout way if you use this with something like a battle plan, right? It's a 2-card combo to sort of draw cards. Very funky. If you upgrade it, though, then it gets a lot better in terms of being a value generator, because now, if you're just purging it and then playing the Smash, it's like you have a Smash in your deck, except that Smash costs 1 less energy, because you gain energy from purging this thing, and then you play the Smash. 1 energy Smash is not that bad, or even crazier, you can potentially purge this to gain an energy, and then you discard the Smash to some sort of effect, and now you've sort of drawn a card off of that as well, and that's really good. That's 2 value generated from 1 card there. Very nice. That being said, how often do you really have the discard that you want to be doing that, and you have an upgrade point to spend on this reinforcements? Because if you have a lot of discard, like a ton of discard, you're probably playing Daughter, and Daughter is known to be very upgrade hungry. So it can be difficult to justify that, especially when if you have that much discard, you're probably perfectly happy just playing the reinforcements and then discarding the Smashes anyway, right? So kind of a funky, weird card, pretty fun. I would say that it is at least worth a B tier for everyone, because everyone has at least some access to discard with Bluestones and stuff. Everyone has at least some desire to just deal large damage in the early game. The very, peak of this thing, when it's at its best, is a lot higher than a lot of those other early game oriented cards we've talked about, but its lows are also lower. I think that balances out to justify making it B tier for everyone, but this one's leaning a little bit towards C tier for most characters, and probably solidly B tier for Daughter. Next, we've got Reload, one of those draw and discard effects I was just talking about. Draw 2, discard 2, overcharge 1. So you're getting 1 fewer card out of the deal than with Battle Plan, but it costs 0 instead of 1, and you get some bonus overcharge. Pretty handy. Same upgrade, +1 draw, +1 discard. It's good. It's good for pretty much all of the same reasons as Battle Plan is good, right? Draw consistency, what have you. It gives you a bit of overcharge too, which can be nice. That being said, it is an uncommon. The bar is a bit higher. I kind of feel like this is going to be a B tier card, to be quite honest. Almost just based on that alone. And the fact that you don't get to keep the extra card can, be a bit of an issue. The fact that you're discarding more can also be an upside, though, if you're trying to trigger discard effects, I guess, right? So yeah. That's kind of all I have to say about this. It really is just very similar to Battle Plan, so most of the analysis remains the same. We talked about reinforcements. How about just regular old Smash? Well, it pretty much is what I've been saying about all those other early game damage dealers. It's a B tier, right? It helps you out early on. It's at its worst on Corruption Daughter because a lot of the damage is gated behind this effect being Rage, so you want to play this and other attacks. Corruption Daughter probably doesn't have those other attacks, but Sultide Daughter certainly does, so it's not bad enough for me to put it in C tier for Daughter. Everyone else, they have some amount of attack damage. Tempest maybe likes this a bit more because, the heavy interaction and she likes Rage. But not enough to bump it up to A tier for her. So, yeah, it just ends up being a B tier for everyone. B plus for Tempest, I guess B minus for Daughter. Sneak Attack. Sneak Attack is a weird card. I really like Sneak Attack. I think it's super fun. And until it had this Purge effect, I would have, really tried to justify making it a B tier just because I like it. But it really was not very good. back before it got the buff. Now that it does have that Purge Rage 25 effect, it's definitely a B tier for everyone, because that's really powerful. Just unequivocal 25% Rage and gaining an energy off of this thing. Pretty good. Everyone can pretty much make some use of that, with the exception of some Corruption Daughter decks, and then you'll appreciate this for its upfront damage to help you kill some of the early elites. It's great against Bruce. It's great against the Skeletal Mage. The upgrade on it just increases the default damage, which is fine. It's not exactly the most amazing thing, but it's pretty decent. Tempest can use this thing to trigger Shock, which is cool. Most of her things that can hit more than twice require you to spend a lot of energy on them. This one's just 2 energy. It can hit, like, 3, 4, or 5 times in the right fight. This one takes a serious hit if you're playing with Blind Spot on, because the fights where it's really good and the fights where it's really bad, obviously you're not going to know going into it which one is which. So there is that to consider. But even then, of course, you can just be purging it and you'll be reasonably happy with that. So definitely a B tier for everyone, even though most of the time it's just going to be purged. Next we've got Time to Maim. Time to Maim is a bit of an awkward one. If all you're getting out of this thing is 50 rage, it's not that great. It's not that bad, but it's not that great. So you really do want to be getting that 6 block as well, which requires you to have no rage at all. And sometimes that's a problem, because sometimes you're just gaining rage almost passively, right? So Tempest Zeal powers can gain you rage, maybe as you're drawing into this thing, and then you'll be a bit sad. Or if you have, like, Grounded, right, you can just be starting your turn with rage. Hidden has several relics that can be giving him rage. Obviously, if you have any kind of delay rage going on, that's going to disable the Time to Maim. And in all of those instances, it's pretty bad. But otherwise, if you are actually getting 6 block and 50% rage, then it's pretty good. It's kind of comparable to Surefoot in that case, right? If you play an upgraded Surefoot without a stone in it, you just play that twice, that's 10 block and 50 rage. This being 6 block and 50 rage for 1 less energy looks really appealing. Also, if you upgrade it, then you can suddenly be getting the full 100% rage for just 1 energy, which with Surefoot required an upgrade and a red stone. So this is starting to look pretty impressive, right? So it really does just depend how many effects do you have that can disable this thing. If you don't have that many, this is really good, especially upgraded. It's just a big old rage generator, and you get some block too. Why not? But if you do have a lot of those effects, this thing pretty quickly becomes just, like, unplayable. So you have to bear that in mind. I would probably just give it a B tier overall, though, because the upside, when it works out, is really quite strong. Next, we've got Zigzag, and I hate this card. This is going to be a C tier for all of the characters, if you ask me. Not a fan of Zigzag. It is just so inconsistent. It cares about half the number of cards in your discard pile, so that means that it's very volatile in terms of its value. When you draw it is a big, concern as for how much value you'll actually get out of it. Cards that just give you block already are kind of volatile, because you never know if you're going to need block on a given turn, and so you really don't want to add any more volatility to that. This one, of course, it gives you block and delay block, so it's quite a bit less likely that you won't need either of those two things, right? Most enemies will attack you at least once over the course of 2 turns, so you'll probably get some value, but how much block are you actually getting, right? It could be a pretty low amount. If you upgrade this, it starts to look a lot better because you're getting twice the initial block. But I just wouldn't want to upgrade this thing most of the time. Usually I'd be quite happy to spend my upgrades elsewhere. Yeah, I don't like it. Moving on to the rares, we got Aggressive Attack. Aggressive Attack is sick. This is an A tier card. 3 for 30 damage. That's a lot of damage. You're also applying 1 vulnerable. That's pretty good. Vulnerable's great. You're also recurring a random attack to immediately take advantage of the vulnerable, or to immediately recoup some of the energy you spent on this big expensive card. fantastic. It's just a very nice self-synergistic package, and if you upgrade it, you're getting extra damage and another stack of vulnerable, which is a really big deal. So, I mean, pretty much everybody likes this card. It's very strong. Definitely an A tier. Good source of vulnerable, good source of damage. Yeah, all around just a great, great card. Everybody likes it. Next we have All Alone. And All Alone is not as good as Aggressive Attack. It's just another big damage dealer. This one is kind of got this interesting utility to it where it can either be an AoE card or a single target card. In terms of AoE, 12 to everybody for 2 is pretty decent, especially relatively early in the run, although it's pretty hard to find rare cards that early. So, you know, I guess a Blood Library is your best bet to find this early on. By the late game, 12 to everybody doesn't seem all that much. You really do need to be supplementing it with Rage or Vulnerable or something. If you upgrade it, the damage there doesn't change either. So really it does, even though it has this like interesting utility, it does mostly just kind of become a single target damage dealer that can trigger Void Stones a lot of times. So a Red Stone on this is pretty impressive. If you've upgraded it, 12 damage plus 3 additional triggers with a Red Stone going into the mix each time. It's going to be quite a bit of damage and quite a bit of rage. Very impressive if you manage to do exactly that. If you don't manage to do exactly that, then it's not that impressive. It's not bad, but it's not super likely to be like, you know, a card that you just slot in every time you see it. So because of that, I have to give it B tier. For everyone. Again, right? It's just a big damage card. Everyone appreciates that to some degree. Next, we have Counter. Counter is a very cool card. Block 2 each time an attack is played. It's very expensive to get into play, and the upgrade does not help with that. All it does is increase the amount of block you gain, but that's very significant. A 1.5 times increase on the block gained per attack played. So unsurprisingly, this is great on Hidden, definitely an S tier for Hidden, because of all of his token attacks that he can generate. He can get tons of block. This can be all the block you ever need in your Enlightened, or excuse me, in your Hidden deck. You can literally cut almost all of your block cards once you get a counter. You can even put a Blackstone in this thing and double stack it, and just go absolutely ham. Very cool. It's also got some pretty good utility on Enlightened, again with those stabilities. Pretty handy. You can spam out lots of attack cards due to the cost decreasing effects of Zen, so that's pretty cool as well. So I would say it's an A tier for him. For Tempest, it's probably a B tier card because you do spend a lot of the time on Tempest playing bigger, more expensive block card or attack cards, excuse me. But it can still definitely have some uses with her. She sometimes likes to play cheaper stuff, right? You know, like the Power Strikes. You know, batters are pretty decent throughout a lot of the run. And even if you're not, like, really milking this thing for a ton of value, it's still pretty decent just to throw it out and, you know, get a handful of block here and there in addition to whatever you were already doing. It's a good deal almost no matter how you look at it in terms of the amount of block you can get for the energy you're spending on it. So that just leaves Daughter, and Daughter definitely makes the least use of this. Obviously, Corruption Daughter doesn't play very many attacks for the most part at all, and Soul Tithe Daughter, you know, you're going to be taking on quite a bit of extra damage from your Soul Tithe, so spending 3 energy on Counter starts to become a little bit questionable because of how quickly you need to move to end fights on Soul Tithe Daughter. So for that reason, I think it's actually going to be a C tier for Daughter, which I think makes this the first and only card that is going to receive a different rating for every character. To recap, that's S tier for Hidden, A tier for Enlightened, B tier for Tempest, and C tier for Daughter. Definitely an interesting card. Next is Defensive Attack, cousin to Aggressive Attack, and it's really, really good, just like Aggressive Attack. You get a big chunk of damage, 25, you get 5 block, you get 5 delay block, quite a bit of defense, good chunk of damage, and if you upgrade it, it gets really crazy. What an insane upgrade. 10 block, 10 delay block. That's just ridiculous. That is so much defense and a good chunk of offense in one tidy package. Very powerful card. It has the block tag, so you can double trigger it and stuff with some of those artifacts, which is really, really cool. Just an all-around great card. Everybody needs block here and there. Everybody appreciates a big beat stick sometimes. So this one is A tier for everybody. Next, we have Enough Suffering. This one is another pretty interesting card. Expel all afflictions, purge, heal 1. The purge effect is pretty much completely incidental. You can ignore it. It doesn't matter. That's just there so that you can do something with it when you don't want to play it quite yet. So, like, versus the Void Fight, for example, you want to wait to play this until the minions have died for the most part. You might even wait until the Void has taken its action where it adds garbage cards. And you can get some value out of it maybe in that regard, I guess. The upgrade increases the purge healing and adds this other heal 4. Pretty irrelevant. You don't really care about upgrading this thing. It's pretty much just there for decks that are stuck with voids in them for one reason or another. If you aren't able to purge them all before the end game, you're really going to appreciate this. It also has a few specific use cases, like obviously it's an excellent way to take out the Puppet Master. It can be really good against some of the other enemies that benefit from afflictions particularly, so it's good against the Taxidermist, you aren't stuck with Banes in hand, buffing his unholy creations. It's good against the Hag, it's good against the Swamp Witch, who want you to draw Banes to trigger their passives. So because of that, it's good enough to be a B tier, I would say, on Hidden, Tempest, and Enlightened. Daughter probably could put it in B tier as well, but notably, Void coins are afflictions, so you'll delete all of your Void coins that you work so hard to generate if you play in Enough Suffering, which is really sad. So it's like a B- for her, I guess. I almost wanted to put it in C tier, but not every deck uses Void coins on Daughter, and you will still appreciate getting rid of the other afflictions you have. Notably, of course, sins are afflictions too, so, bear that in mind. Of course, a couple of them expel, so if you've already expelled that sin, then you don't need to worry about it. Just something to consider. Overall, it's a pretty decent card. You just put it in versus the guys that are affliction-oriented, and you'll be pretty happy. So, B tier for everyone, but B- for Daughter, maybe. Ice Wall. Ice Wall is a favorite of mine. It is super strong. It's basically like Tower Shield on crack. It is a reduced threat to 0 effect, which is crazy. Expels. And if you purge it, you get 5 block without even having to upgrade it. It just does that naturally, which is ridiculous. Who even cares that it costs 4? On the turn you play it, it's well worth that 4. And every time when you don't play it, the cost is irrelevant. You're just purging it for 5 block. And the upgrade's really good too. Purge block 8. Back when it was Purge block 10, I might have given it S tier. Now that it's 8, it's still extremely good, but I do think it's probably just an A tier at this point for everyone. Super duper powerful effect. Great to foresee on Enlightened. Everyone else just really likes to use it normally. It's a great card. And that leaves us with just one left. Supernova. We're skipping Meteor because that's not a card you can normally obtain. Supernova is a pretty weird one. I guess you could call this part of the Overcharge crew because of that Slay effect. But it's not exceptionally easy to really take advantage of that thing. It doesn't care about you having Overcharge in the way a lot of the other ones do that made it so good on Tempest. I don't think it particularly stands out on Tempest at all, actually. In fact, I think it's just a B tier card in general. It is a pretty big AoE effect. It's certainly a better AoE effect than All Alone. For 1 extra energy, you're getting a whopping 26 damage instead of 12. Well worth it. If you do happen to get any slays, it's refunding the energy, which is nice. And if you upgrade it, of course, it actually does increase the AoE damage, unlike All Alone. 32 damage to everyone. That is a lot. And the Slay effect goes up too, which is a nice bonus, I guess. It's just a big old AoE bonker, Sometimes you'll want that, and it'll be pretty good for the job. Other times you just don't need that at all, and you won't care about this card, but it's strong enough that I'm willing to put it in B tier. The earlier you find it, the better most of the time. Doesn't really have any particular synergies. Obviously, as an expensive card, it's nice to foresee. But that's about it. You know, the fact that it's heavy doesn't really matter that much either. Yeah, just a B tier all around. And that'll wrap it up. All 53, I think, right? 52, because we're not counting Meteor. Yeah. Cards ranked there. Hopefully it wasn't too confusing trying to juggle through all the characters like that. If you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like. Drop a subscribe if you want to see more content like this. We've still got a couple more tier lists to go through, some relics, some cards. Daughter stuff's still going to be waiting until the daughter character patch comes out, which is still in the works. Don't worry, it's coming. Just on hold for the time being. So anyway, I'll catch you guys all next time, and peace out.